Hi there, this is Chris Jones from CJ Learning, the Smart Curriculum Academy. This afternoon session on timetable recovery, innovative concept this afternoon, innovative solutions for reducing movement and contact. Over the last 3 weeks particularly, we've been working with a whole load of schools that are trying to deal with this issue. They've spent most of the summer term writing a timetable to fit the school for their normal purposes with this idea of returning to school in mind, and then with the government advice around 2 weeks ago found that the social distancing rules and regulations, or at least advisory, have left us with some questions, and I just wanted to put out in a conversation, and I would invite your input, please. So, I mean, how you're dealing with the issues. I am going to get back to some theory about how schools are put together, because I believe there's a sense in which we come back to the values and the essence of what we're trying to achieve when we face issues like we're facing at the moment, rather than just the mechanistic systems of, well, how are we going to get children back into the school and deal with the social distancing. It does ask the questions about what we're doing in terms of putting a school together. So let's just hit off with where we're at. No, excuse me, I'm not going to do the whole thing by PowerPoint slides, but it is just a great way of bringing together the kind of the purpose of what we're here to look at. So what schools are facing, whether you're dealing with primary or secondary or any other part of the school system, is this question around how do we reduce contact between individuals, enabling social distancing where possible, and how do we create these bubbles or classes that stay together for the majority of the teaching time. Within most schools, we are in this the methodology is well established in schools that we have different ways of putting children together across a timetable cycle, which is great for community cohesion because it gets different people engaged with each other. But we're now in a situation where we are trying to reduce that contact. We're trying to stop students moving around the building, having contact with multiple adults and other visitors in the school. And as much as we might say it's possible to stop other people coming into the building, there will always be adults around because they're buildings that need to be managed and repaired and washed and cleaned and so on and so forth. There's lots of things going on. So how do we reduce this contact issue? Now, one way that's possible to be done is through reducing movement points. So children are more static, staff are more simply based in single rooms. At one end, that would be a very primary style of modelling where a single teacher would exist with a single cohort of learners. Now the question, certainly in the primary setting where they've been dealing with bubbles of up to 15, that has been very successful, been challenging and stressful for those involved, but it has been successful in maintaining a single group of students with one input person, or at least a small number of input people. That other question then within the secondary modelling is how do we reduce the input staff, and what implications does that have for the system? And I'll come to a question about that in a moment, but how do we reduce the number of people that have a input capacity to that group of students, that group of learners? What we're seeing in terms of people's reactions are a number and quite dramatic changes. I'd say this would be innovative. I mean, whether you got to that point of actually doing these things yet, we know that there are a number of schools that are planning to re-timetable, reconfigure over this period, and they've spent some time, some schools up to 10 days of solid work of reviewing the building, reviewing the staffing, reviewing union input of, what's right for teaching staff. Does it change their terms and conditions of service, and all sorts of things like that. But what we're seeing is, from the most popular structure being the 25 period week, 50 period cycle in a secondary environment, or a 25 period 5-hour day in a primary environment, some attempts to reduce the movement points. Now, this might look like 3 100-minute lessons in a day, an hour and 40 minutes, which has implications for staff planning at the moment, because you've built your timetable and deployment around particular proportionality of lessons. We are seeing a lot of schools move to a 3-period day. So rather than the 3 logical units of 2 hours, 2 hours, 1 hour, they're evening it out and making 3 single periods. Some even going for 2 single blocks of time, long 2-hour sessions, or even 2.5-hour sessions in one example. But this has implications for staff deployment and staff planning, because the more we reduce those combinations, either the more generalist the staff need to become, because they're either going to deliver, your 1 hour a week of music suddenly becomes a 2.5-hour lesson, one of 10 periods in a cycle. Well, that's not feasible. So does the member of staff then engage in some generalist delivery? So at one extreme, this becomes a little problematic. It might be okay to consider large chunks of time in English, maths, and science. Might be more problematic in languages. And so staff deployment, do we bring people in? Do we double up staffing? And that's a question that some are battling over. But it will question the general expertise of the teaching staff. By far the most prolific change, if people are looking at changing the cycle, is to go for this 15-period or 10-period week. 15-period is the most common that we've seen over this last couple of weeks of conversation. So logically, the timetable stays in its form, 3 logical blocks a day, but they're just of longer format. However, the changes are very much about the building and the context. It would appear that and I'll come to some of this in a minute, some of the very practical things around are your buildings fit for this kind of work? Some of the newer BSF and academy buildings, which seem to be built in zones, are a little easier to handle. But certainly one of the ones I'm going to show you in a moment, has gone for this 15 period a week, 3 periods a day, 3 100-minute lessons in a day, are struggling for zoning schools because they just don't have the ability. I'm thinking of schools out in rural Norfolk and out in Buckinghamshire and Bedfordshire and further beyond, where they're struggling to find, because their buildings are built for a particular methodology, which we'll come to in a moment, but they're struggling to find that zonal possibility. So they've gone for changing the day because that reduces movements. Schools that have the kind of zonal ability, so often newer buildings which have clusters of rooms together, are finding it more easy to stick to the 5 period a day with ways of managing their deployment of staff within that. So, in terms of innovation, it is about what you've got the facility to achieve. Some schools are simply saying that we are going to stick to the logic of what we do, but we are going to reduce the learning time. It's a very practical and pragmatic way of doing it. What I'm talking about as a school in Bedfordshire, I'm thinking of particularly, and we've worked with a couple of others that have done the same, that are simply saying they don't have the mechanism or the means to change the structure of their day. So what they're doing is looking at reducing the length of periods. Doesn't change any of the physicality of the building and the movement times, but for them, it's just simply a way of handling what's going on in the building. They've got a long street, the school I'm thinking of, and they want to keep students away from that area. So they're using shorter period times and then flexible movement times within that longer period of break, so that students can move without coming into contact with other pupils. The question that a number of schools are asking is around the catch-up periods, and it seems almost counterintuitive to the whole process. So where we're thinking about keeping students together in single bubbles or units, then mixing them up during the day into a different format for catch-up delivery, maybe catch up in English, catch up in maths, catch up in science, and then across the curriculum. That seems counterintuitive. It does seem difficult to suggest that you're going to have commonality within the units of delivery and then change all of that for later, or rather change all that within the cycle. Now, the thing that we seem to be facing, and what the schools are questioning, is this whole issue of change and change and change and change. So our learners have had this, well, in fact, everybody has had this situation thrust upon them. There's not much that we've been able to do about that. So we've had the online learning and people engaging, and the well-being phone calls, and all of that work that's being done differently within schools. We're then talking about coming back with a school day that could be different and could be unsettling. And then we're questioning, well, when's this going to change and come back to what we might call as normal? So a lot of schools are beginning to question this. Change creates noise. Noise creates disruption. How can we reduce the disruption? So some schools are saying, well, irrespective of when the normal comes back, we are going to stick with whatever we create for the whole year, or at least for 2 terms within the year. There seems to be a lot of schools suggesting that the time to change would be at Christmas. Others are saying, well, it might be at Easter or at the half term of February. But the issue being, the more noise we create by change, the more disruption we take. As you know, children and adults take time to embed the learning flow, the rhythm, as I refer to it when we're working with schools. That rhythm of the day, that rhythm of the week, that rhythm of a cycle is important to keep. And you know, we know in challenging schools, children will use every excuse not to get to where they need to be, because they'll say, well, I don't know, I'm not sure where I am, I don't know what week it is, I don't know what cycle we're working on. So the whole point of conversation that's been had within this whole dialogue has been around, can we reduce the disruption, and is there a way of making it so that we can have sort of normality across the year? So just, I want to go into have a look before I ask you for some questions or anything that you want to feed back on. But that seems to me to be the issues that we're dealing with where we are at the moment. So the goals to reduce the number of contacts, the amount of movement, and I would say at the end of that, another goal, which I don't hear talked about a lot, but this issue of trying to reduce the disruption and change, and what that might be like, and can we make that as easy as it can be. So in terms of what we're seeing now, that these are Nova T cycled designs, rather than the model, what I kind of want to lead into is that changing the logic of a day, changing the logic of a cycle, has implications for what you do within the school. Attendance, lesson monitoring, and all of the other things that are attached to this cycle. What you can see on the screen are 2 quite different schools. One has a very simple, straightforward 5-period day, 10-period fortnight. Nothing complicated about it. It happens to be an 11 to 16 school. They have an intervention class in what would be period 6 in a lot of schools, and instead of forms, they have what they call learning families, which are on the far left-hand side of the screen. So registration over here, intervention classes, and then the typical movement times would be at every break. Now there would be break times and a lunch time between period 4 and 5. And an end of the day break. So there, in this cycle, there are actually 6 movement points within the day. Now, the one below it you see is a much more complex version of the same thing. Actually, it's no different. They have preschool sessions, they have post-school sessions, P and 6, and they have, well, it's not really a split lunch. It's actually intended this way to create the possibility of having duty times, and so they record duties within the break. So logically, these 2 are exactly the same. Now, what both of these schools have moved forward to is a change where they've gone to this 3-period day. Now, one of the things that they've done is to get rid of tutor time, so students go straight into learning. They've got a staggered break time. We're seeing this more of this in the cycling. A single 100-minute period 2, another staggered break time, and then period 3. So there are, in fact, only 3 major movement points during the day. You could say 4 if you say that students are coming in, but obviously a lot of schools are using zonal entry paths to get into the building if you're able to. So reducing movement in contact, and then learners are in these blocks. Now, the timetable that you see below, you can see these, the black sessions, we have staggered time. Now, the staggered time is to allow for an independent study, which is basically the catch-up time for each year group. So year 11, year 10, year 9, year 8, year 7. So they are looking at break times being broken up because they've got less outside space. So they want to be able to have less students around during that time. And they've allowed for supervised tutor times or supported learning times or independent study time. And then in the other main break is the chance to reduce access to the lunch facilities. And they've calculated within this environment that they can have 3 points of access to their lunch facilities, but they've also got a tutor time, so a registration period where learners go to that time. Now that still means that learners are going to 6 different arrangements during the day. Now this particular school is a small school. It doesn't have any zonal capacity. It has no corridors because it's a school that's built out in an area where there's outside space, so learners move outside. So the estimation here is that if learners need to move, they are able to move by moving outside, which is one solution, and that's something that is worth considering here. Schools that are able to zone, this is a school we've been working with locally. They've been able to designate on single floor areas of the building which are kept for 6 classes, because 180 sixth form entry school. Each zone has 7 classrooms, so they are working on the basis that there's no need for more than 6 classes at any point in time. I'll come to what that looks like in curriculum terms in a second. But it's opened up some interesting questions. Do the teachers teach in staff teams? So for example, if we took year group A, could be year 7 or could be year 9. If year A is taught in a bubble or a zone, would there be a designated team for that zone? And schools that we've created this kind of zonal system for, that's what they've basically done. They've said, well, for 1 year group, we need, in terms of delivery capacity, whether we change the timetable or not, so whether you've changed the logic of the framework, they would say, well, maybe 2 or 3 maths teachers, 2 English teachers, 2 science teachers are the staff that are designated for the period that we're going to run this cycle within that particular zone. And so if you have capacity across your staff, and you would have in a school, if you've set your timetable up already, each zone has designated team of staff. So staff are not moving between areas. So the other alternative is you have your children staying still and staff move between the buildings. So when it's a maths lesson, all of the maths staff descend on one zone. Now that's problematic if our premise is at the beginning, do we reduce movement of children, which we're achieving in that goal, but we're not achieving the contact with a range of people. So the staff in teams makes a difference, but it does have an implication for the timetable, again, which I'll come to in a second. What happens with Key Stage 4 and 5? Because obviously their timetable structures are different to Key Stage 3. They have less, they have more specific teaching, it's more specialized. We've got more multidisciplinary blocks where children will go to all sorts of different places around the building. Or one suggestion for that is that a zone, because obviously within these BSF buildings, certainly, there'll be a science block and there'll be a maths block and there'll be a humanities block and there'll be an arts block. There'll be a design technology or creative arts block. So the building, the areas tend to be in specialist disciplines. Now, that causes an issue is if all the children that are in Zone B, the Year B, that are all sitting in science labs, how do other people get access to this? Now, some of the grammar schools that we've been working with have been wrestling with this. Do we have specialist areas, or can we think about rotating the learners around the building? So effectively, we renumber the building, room 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in each of the zones, and children are assigned to that depending on which zone they're in, and then move the children around the zones over a period of, well, if we talk about a 14-week term, they may get 2 weeks in each zone. That way, learners get access to specialist rooms, and then maybe some teaching is done in non-specialist rooms. Some questions going on around what happens within design technology. Is it possible for, within your building, is it possible to deliver some of the specialist courses in non-specialist rooms? For example, food technology. Does every lesson in food technology need to be in a food technology room? That's actually the answer that I've had back from that question is no. There are theory lessons and there are practical lessons. The same technically is true of any subject, because there will always be a taught theory element to subjects, even design technology and sciences. Or we know over the years the issues with science of moving from textbook to practical activity, but they're not suggesting we go back to that textbook activity, but there needs to make sure that there is a diversity of input. So the questions are being asked about not just physically how do we do it, but what does the learning look like and how can we best shape the building to achieve that? Now, certainly BSF and academy buildings that have this zonal style may lend themselves to keeping learners together in groups, but it does open up questions around what happens in terms of specialism. And I'd like just to go into a bit of theory about how we put structure together, because I certainly have found this helpful when we've been unpacking this timetable design with schools. So excuse me for a moment going into a bit of theory about it, but that's where we're going to head now. So here is the questions. On the design continuum of school, we have on the right-hand side what would be referred to as a fully block-based system. On the left-hand side of the screen, you have what's referred to as a fully linear or class-based delivery system. Now, within the school life, within any school structure, there will be a spectrum of those two styles, those two extremes. Typically, in a comprehensive school, in Key Stage 4 and 5, you will see the majority of the style of delivery at the right-hand end, the green end. Generally, block-based delivery. They might be single discipline or multidisciplinary resourcing. So that structurally is how most comprehensive secondary schools are put together. If you went to the other extreme, this is like a primary or a grammar style delivery. You'll find a lot of grammar schools where the classes are common across the timetable. That's not suggesting we're getting into streaming. That's not how we put the group, that's not the theory behind the way we put the groups together. But the structural design is such that the groups are common across a range of subjects. And at that extreme, it would be all subjects. Now, in terms of those two extremes, we know practically that most schools are somewhere in the middle, and they might be nearer the full block or nearer the full class delivery, but that is the style that we see mostly delivered. So in terms of reality, what we're used to is the mindset around that kind of structure. But attached to that structure and that methodology is the thinking around how we put groups together. Now that's why this slide is called Population Design is the Key, because population design is the whole reason behind the way and why we put timetables and structures together. So at one end, we have the targeted population. So we might have what we would refer to as setting. So each of the classes might have a rationale, whether it be ability or mixed ability or whatever that might be. We have a rationale, but the thing is that they're mutually exclusive. Each one of the strips can be a different arrangement. One of the biggest challenges of this in a larger school is, if you look at the one on the end, it's a French block. It's unusual for any school to have the same number of language teachers as it has English teachers or maths teachers or science teachers. Generally, the maths, English and science teams tend to be larger because they tend to be taught in those kind of blocks. In some schools, we have seen, I've worked with some language colleges where they do deliver, and particularly within the technology college setup, when there was that specialism of subject, we had larger teams of technology. If it was a technology school, larger teams of business with business schools. If it was a language school or a science school, you'd see those teams follow. IT within the IT specialist schools. So there are maybe reasons for these being of a different character, but it's unusual to have equal teams across the whole school. So it would be quite unusual to see all of these strips being all blocked delivery. What is common is that they're in a multidisciplinary or option blocks. That could typically be, what you see there would be a sixth form delivery, 5 blocks with multidisciplinary inserts, but they are that block delivery. But that demands that students move around the building to achieve that. Because if you had students in zones, we would have to ship in all of the teams to achieve that ability. So one, we're breaking our second reason for doing this process. So at the other extreme, we have this full class-based delivery. Now, full class-based delivery means that a cohort of students stay in a classroom, so there's a stable population. Some I know are asking the questions about social stagnation, the challenges of having the same group of students together all of the time. And that is one of the strengths of a block-based system because it brings social variety. So on the continuum, you have social variety at one end and social stagnation at the other, or at least social stagnation would be a polite way of putting, because in some cases that can be volatility and quite difficult groupings of students. So the way that you put them together, and again, that's not suggesting any streaming. It's not saying we have high ability and low ability. It is just a population setup that you'd have together. Now, some schools that we are working with have actually done exactly what I've shown on the screen. I'm going to show you some examples of that in a moment of what that would look like. But at one end, this idea of having common populations is very, well, it's the primary model. It's what you see in every primary school. But the question then comes to what's the specialism of the teacher? Because within this design continuum, there is the kind of corollary, the impact of that is what happens with the teaching staff. And if you see that change at the top, because staffing continuum goes from specialists at this end, with the green end, with these, we've got specialist staff delivering specialist methodology, to the generalist delivery at this end. Now the question, and maybe the weakness of this model, is that you've now got, well, are we suggesting it's a single teacher with a single class delivering the whole curriculum? Now that might work in the primary, but it certainly won't work at Key Stage 4 and 5. it would be quite counterintuitive to the way that we've built our schools. And the specialist ability, you know, those of you who know me talk about schools know that I will talk about, we moved from the phases of generalism to specialism across the school, and how do we get to that? And that journey moves between personalisation, where children make choices about their futures. So, you know, in terms of this, the continuum is generalist to personalisation to specialism. But the question over here is, well, could we, and this is what some schools are doing, reduce the zonal teams to a range of only a small group of people who will deliver certain parts of that delivery. So it may be that we have a team for 6 classes of no more than 10 people who would be involved in that delivery. Now the question is that you will need, in the case of music, to have the typical sixth form entry school that generally has one music teacher. Does that music teacher then move around the building? Well, that leads you to the next question, is does the curriculum stay the same? Some of the curriculum decisions that are being looked at is to say, well, maybe we would at this point keep some curriculum off this model. So with the zonal structures that people are using, they're beginning to question whether do we have music in the curriculum? What do we do with art? How do we move, as you saw in the slide previously? So questions around technology, questions around food, questions around music. And is it for a period that we might consider changing that style of curriculum delivery so that we might have some alteration? And I know, again, schools that we've been working alongside have changed that structure, so it does look a little bit different. So some of the subjects that you see listed on this would not be there. It also questions your the capacity to deliver IT. Now, I know lots of schools have been going through that with the online and distance learning technologies, whether our schools are so fitted so that you've got the ability to have laptops around, or does each one of the zones have an IT space? And certainly a school I was dealing with on Friday, that was a question that they're going to invest in a little over the summer. So they are making sure that their Wi-Fi capacity within the school allows them to have tablet-based or certainly laptop-based delivery within each of the zones that they've created. Now that school particularly is not a BSF school. It doesn't have massive amounts of zonal rooms, but it does have the ability to teach in areas. They're wrestling particularly with the question about specialisms. And you know, if you think about a science school, do you put a year group in the science labs? And you know, you can't move our students around too much. But if you do think about moving zones, can you schedule in your deep cleaning around a weekend so that between the Friday finishing and then the Monday that some deep clean has gone on, so that a different group of students could move in? Now that is something that is being explored, so that rather than being static and staying, so this issue of social stagnation, the one thing that students will be used to is that broad variety of moving around the building. And is there one of the noises created, rather than lots of change, not enough change? So that's something to wrestle with within this whole process. So just sort of refreshing over that theory. There's a question there within population design anyway, whatever goes on in school. I mean, actually, you know, whether we're in COVID recovery or not, here is a question about the mindset that we've got used to within schools. So this generalist to specialist, are our staff specialists? And it's interesting moving between schools, and this is where I say the character is different, that you need to consider this implication. If you are a very small school, let's say a 3 or 4 form entry secondary school, your staff tend to be more generalist. because to get a body of 34 staff to cover the 14 subjects and then have a range of, say, 20 or 22 GCSE Key Stage 4 outcome subjects, unlikely to have a sixth form at that size, but it's not impossible. To have that staff, the main staff will be quite generalist in their outlook. If you take a large school and go to the extremes of 360 or 450 in a year group, so a 15 form entry year school or a 12 form entry school, you have much larger teams. Your English team is probably around 20. You will have more staff and they will tend to be more specialist in nature. So the flexibility to respond to the current crisis will also, well, not just your physicality, your building, is it an old Victorian building or a new BSF Academy style building, but how big are you and what's the breadth of your staffing capacity in terms of their normal working practices? Are they able to think in terms of being more generalist or more specialist? Because the modelling that we're looking at certainly requires there to be more generalist mindset, more generalist ability. Excuse me 1 second. It's a conversation to be had at the kind of the base level, excuse me, of delivery, because it forms the basis of how this whole structure works. Certainly the mindset in most schools has been moving towards a more specialist style delivery. If you're an upper school and you don't have the sort of the Key Stage 3 part of the school, there's obviously more specialism. If you're an all-through school where that's got primary involved in the teaching, generally you'll keep the students separate, but there's much more crossover in the staffing. And I would extend a thought to you in terms of the way that we look at the way we put school together. It's certainly worth considering that, and it's been interesting from our point of view of seeing schools of different size and the way that they respond in that way, because it's very interesting to see very large schools becoming very specialist. You know, we're down to employing our economics teacher rather than our general business IT teacher. We tend to you know, our English language or English literature specialists, where in other schools they teach English and they might teach history or they might teach humanities subjects as a broader subject base. So that generalism to specialism is an interesting field, and certainly it might be something that is going to impact what's going on within this next period. So the structures that we see, theoretically, it is going to put an imposition on the way that we deliver. Now, is that mitigated by having online learning and teachers are teaching, as in they are helping students to learn? I'll go back to that example where tutors are working with groups daily on individualized support work, changing the methodology right from I'm teaching my subject to encouraging the learners to learn. That's quite a different culture. Now, one of the things that I've come into the conversations with schools over this period of time is how much of the legacy of this period, what's going to be left over a period of time now from what we see within schools as a necessity to get us through this period, and what's going to be left in terms of moving forward, and how are things going to change for the better. I always see the good in these things, but how much is going to move forward and leave its legacy within our school lives. So just move on now. So in terms of returning to normal, whatever normal might look like, some are asking the questions of, and I've said myself here, you know, so this issue of the noise of change, what's it going to look like? Well, let's just unpack a little. I've done a lot of talking, and please, if you have questions or you want me to go through something, or you'd like to ask something about the kind of theory that we've just looked at, please just drop it in the chat, and I will pause just for a moment as we move forward. Nothing particularly at the moment. So, okay, if you're comfortable, I will move on. So the question, and again, this is a system that's not often used within schools very much. We've seen typically the idea that a timetable is created and it's there for a year. So it starts at the beginning of the academic year and it ends at the other end of the academic year. Within the timetable packages, this is represented on the screen here by the validity range. Now, for some time, I've worked with schools that are looking at, well, typically the drop day. You find drop days where people don't suspend the timetable, or they do suspend the timetable physically and language and narrative in the school, but they don't do it in terms of anything other than, no, we can't take registers for the day, or we can't do work on the lesson monitor. Many don't realize that within the systems there is the capability to do it. The reason is this validity range is basically saying how long we apply a timetable for. So within this timetable, the date range has been set from the 1st of September to the 31st of August. Now, that would be a typical cycle. Now, normally you wouldn't change, you do need to go into August, obviously, because of exam results and getting classes and so on. That's not for here. But what I would suggest is that over this next year, it may be that you are going to have 2 versions or 3 versions of your timetable. And the way that we can ease the process, a lot of schools have created their timetable already, the one that they were expecting to deliver next year with all the uncertainty of what was coming. They're now looking at a recovery period. So what would that look like? Now, we don't know how long it's going to be, and your circumstance might dictate when that change happens. But what can happen within the process is that we set a validity range, and it might be, for example, that we set it from the 1st of September to the 31st of December. So it might run for the whole of one cycle. Now, that means that we could have a validity range with a timetable running for that period of time. Then we might then drop back to, and it's very rare that it will be exactly what's being created, because I know in many circumstances staffing changes and other decisions, classes will have moved around, the sixth form will have become more embedded in the school, and it might be that that needs to be altered. But we see these ranges appear, and it may be that you want to change them. So initially, depending on what happens with the pandemic, it could be that your intentions are that we would have a cycle design for the first term. And then the second cycle design would run from 1st of January 2021 to the 31st of August 2021. Now, all we simply do is upload those 2 files. There's nothing more to be done. As long as the changeover point is at the end of a cycle, there is no difficulty. And we are seeing schools that are saying now, we have one cycle design that we're going to use for the transition period, and we have another one that we're going to come back to normal, whatever that normal looks like. Some schools are suggesting that they're going to run 3, that they would run a changed day in the first cycle. They're going to go back to the normal day in the second cycle, and they'll go back to all full normal day in the third cycle. And my only question about that is, as I go back to the principles that I laid out in the beginning, changing too many things within the year can be quite problematic. Too much disruption creates too much noise, and noise creates a lack of learning time. So it's really difficult to think about doing too much change within the year. So it's really important to keep that cycle down to as fewer changes as possible. But I understand if you want to tweak things through the year and you want to start with a zonal delivery for a period, and it may be, and I know one school that is looking at doing half a term of zonal delivery and then gradually easing out of that process. Now, they're going to do it through a timetable structure, but this is how that would be achieved. Now, again, it's not something that we see being done in a lot of schools, apart from when I go in and they say, we're going to change the day completely. We want to have a different cycle after Christmas. And then we go through this validity range changing. But in terms of its delivery, you can have a timetable that's prepared and set up for a period and then change it into a different cycle. So in terms of how you would do that, that's the cycle design. Now, I'm just going to move to what would this look like. So here is Novity, what a lot of people are used to seeing. In terms of what a timetable would look like in terms of its difference, you see here a year 7 timetable. So typically, this is the block structure that I was talking about earlier. So English, maths, science, 2 linear blocks, one of humanities and languages, one of creative and performing arts, a PE block, and then what this school refers to as enterprise, which is basically resistant materials, food, health and social care, and business and enterprise. Now, what they're going to do for this next, the first phase of delivery is to reduce their delivery into one single population. Now, the kind of work that they've done already means that they've decided not to deliver resistant materials, although it's written here as resistant materials or DT on this blocking. They're going to deliver philosophy and ethics, which is more about social skills and development of their thinking and well-being, to one, alleviate what's gone on over this period of time and some challenges in a challenging school, and to support learners over a period of time. But if I look at this structure, this is what we would refer to as a typically linear structure delivery. Now, if in terms of timetabling, this is relatively easy because this is the type of timetabling that any school would put into their system to create flexibility and movement. It does mean that there's no time that there are 3 English classes going on or 3 maths classes going on. But if you're going to deliver this style, why would you bother with having banding? There's no need for banding at this point. So you can see on this cycle, and see I'm going to get rid of that particular structure there, 6 classes delivered in 6 classrooms. So that's the zonal delivery that I referred to earlier, where learners would stay in the same classroom for the whole of the cycle. They might move out for escorted PE, and the ideas around that are come in your PE kit, so we don't have to clean the changing rooms multiple times. That's impossible with the lead time that's going to be. One of the biggest implications here is the facility and allowing science to go on and music to go on and arts to go on. And is that done in the same classroom that your English is moving on? Now, schools that are looking at this way of modulating lessons are suggesting that within the 6 classrooms, there might be a classroom that is where the DT, or the version of DT and art might go on. And there might be a larger space that music, or at least performing arts, might be controlled. And then there are clear classrooms that are used for maths and English and humanities and geography. And out of those 6, there would be a small amount of movement between the 6 classrooms. So we'll go back to that population stagnation. It does give learners the chance to move around a zone, even if they don't move around the whole school. They might get to be out of the zone for a period of time. Now, the question at that point is, although our cycle is 50, because that's the way that our staff deployment has been designed, if we keep to this structure, technically, I don't have to worry about 2-week cycle. I could go back to a single-week cycle, as long as I can keep the proportions around even. So instead of having 2 music lessons, just have 1 music lesson. Instead of having 2 art lessons, instead of having 6 or 8 maths lessons, I have 3 or 4 maths lessons. So the proportionality stays the same. If your structure can work like that, I can work on a single week structure in timetabling terms, that would be an interleaved timetable where they kind of mesh. They work, one week works exactly the same as the other. But logically, I could deliver that. Now, the only difficulty with that, and I'm just going to zip back to my view of the screen here, the ranges where I'm going to deliver my ranges, I would have to be very careful about adding my my timetable cycle back to Sims, because if I change the cycle, I am going to have to do a lot of fiddling around with what that looks like in terms of registrations and attendances and so on, because it will be different in the way that it's recorded. So that's why in this school, just bringing that one back, it was decided to leave it at a 50-period cycle, so we don't have to change the logic of the cycle, even if it looks exactly the same from one week to another. The beauty of doing it as a linear style, which is what this would be, the class delivery style, is that it's actually quite automatic. Now, some of the schools that I've shown how to do this, if you timetable this way, you can actually do the whole of a timetable in an afternoon rather than spending a whole term going through the whole delivery. It is slightly beneficial that you've already sorted your staffing structures out. The one thing that will impact its ability to mirror one week to the other, and again, this is where some schools have struggled over this period, is the part-timers generally. If you've got part-timers that work on mirrored weeks, then it's a lot easier. If you have part-timers that don't work on mirrored weeks, that will impact the whole. But don't forget, if you're working with a smaller team, you're working on a team delivery, then it may be that, well, you've got less people moving around the building, so you can put your part-time staff in particular positions where you can job share and allow that some of that work to be a little easier in its working. There certainly will be shared classes in that kind of deployment. The other one is how we're using our agency staff within this model, because it may be that rather than your agency staff just filling in a holes around the school, because that will be an interesting one to work through with, because and certainly some of the advice suggests that keeping them consistent, daily cover will be difficult, bringing other adults in, and I'm not going to go into that or all the advice around that, but in terms of how you would put them into this structure, where you would use them, is going to bring some interesting dimensions to it. Now, in terms of this structure, and I'm conscious of timing, just going through this process. So it's possible to change this structure across a school of size. Obviously, if you've got a larger school, and we work up with schools that have got up to 15 forms of entry, if you've got that kind of structure, I mean, obviously, this 6 forms here, the zones will be different, the school will be bigger, and you won't necessarily be talking about year group zones. It may be sub-year group zones that you're working to. We've got a couple of schools of that size, and there's no reason to think of it being a single year group. It may be that you want to look at substructures of that. The question will always remain, what about Key Stage 4? Now, obviously, Key Stage 4, it may be, and certainly in this one, we've got specialist deliverers working here, and then we've got our option structures. Now, what some schools are looking at is using within that zonal idea, within the option blocks, allowing certain areas of the building to be designated as for option block use only. Particularly, they tend to be common subjects. In a typical school, 20 lessons within an option block range. So over 2 year groups, year 10 and year 11, we've got 40 periods out of the 50 using those areas. So what I referred to earlier as the zones, some of the specialist zones that may have more than the core delivery, offering donor classes that are kept aside, and particularly if they've got external access where people can come through from other ways to ingress and egress the building, it means that there will be less contact. That's not always the case. I mean, obviously some ordinary classrooms don't have external doorways. If you're on upper floors, that's not possible either unless you've got balcony delivery. But it's certainly something, again, it's context delivery, it's context specific. Some of the schools that are about in the rural areas that are obviously all on the ground floor, and we work with some that are only one-story buildings, that's a lot easier to deal with. If you've got a 3-story building with no balconies to the outside and they've got to come through the heart space to get into a block, that is more problematic. So obviously that's more difficult. Now, schools that are looking, that have got high dependency on options, particularly schools that are still looking at a 3-year Key Stage 4, so they've got multiple option block structures, large option blocks, and in this case there'd be 60 periods, which is more than a cycle, so there's always going to be lots of classes on. They are the ones that tend to be looking at the phased reopening, or at least the transition periods. So that they're the ones that are saying, move that away, shorten this period of time. So it's about getting them back into the school and have a longer middle transition once we've got into the pattern. So they're beginning to look at other ways of getting into the school, and it may be so that the get into the school might be over here, shorter, maybe half term, so 6 weeks of a transition model, then something like 18 weeks of that more consolidated delivery, and then returning to something normal towards the end of the year. So they're the kind of styles of delivery that we are seeing people work to. What I've tried to do is to show you, one, the mechanism by which it happens, and certainly it's possible to think about some different styles of delivery, but obviously the goals are still the same. All of it has got to be about reducing contact between individuals. Now, that you may not be able to get into large amounts of social distancing because, I mean, ironically, we are in the BSF Academy Build BB98, BB103 territory, where the school classrooms have been smaller than they were. We've also been through school rebuilds where buildings that were added to through capital programs, added classrooms and added resources and added rooms, were then knocked down and then built to BB103 or BB98 within the cycle that we've just been through over the last 14, 15 years, and now end up with less classrooms. Zonal delivery might be possible, but certainly having extra rooms is unusual in some of the newer buildings, unless they were able to keep some of the outlying buildings that were left within the cycling. I know many schools where that was just ignored completely. The whole site was flattened and a new BB103, BB98 specification building was put together, and that building is based on the capacity requirement for the school, and there is no extra space. So social distancing in those kind of environments is going to be challenging. So where that's not possible, and where that's allowed for within the guidance, reducing movement and reducing the input staff combinations seems to me to be the most viable way forward. The creation of bubbles, I'm not sure why bubbles is an interesting word, but anyway, I mean, if we go back to military, I suppose it would be a platoon, groups of squads. But anyway, we don't want to get into a military scenario, but the idea of classes, rather than sets and setting, the idea of classes across a wider range of populations seems to be the stability producing methodology. But it has got questions to ask and answer, and a lot of those, as I've tried to show you here, are specifically building specific, that they are building specific, and they are context related. One of the things that I didn't write on the slide that I showed you about that continuum, where we've got the primary style through to the comprehensive ideal, I talked about the stagnation of social groupings to the flexible and variety of social groupings. It may be that there are some questions that you'd have about wanting to move students around. I mean, it's not getting into the setting and streaming debate. It's not about ability ranges. It's purely about the moving students around within a zone. And certainly schools, excuse me, schools that we have worked specifically with to achieve that, where the context really does demand the variety of learning populations, that the bubbles are considered across the main group, not moving students around a lot, but giving there some variety. It is seen to be desirable. I would question whether it is overtly viable in terms of reducing infection, certainly with all the new information we're getting around aerosol infection, and whether that's viable to keep that going for long. Hopefully, if we can do this for a period and the infection rates go down, we're not going to see schools being affected. And certainly if there are cases, and again, I know as we've been working through with some schools, as we've done this work and as they've been working with key workers, children and others, where infections happened, if you've been able to keep the bubbles fairly rigorously tight, then certainly stay at home orders and so on that follow that, social isolation that follows, has been easier to track. Whether you've got the track and trace in place, at least it means that you can manage it. Certainly, I'm not purporting here that lots of social mixing is desirable. Certainly, in terms of infection control, reducing that would be important. But what I hope I've done is to show the dilemma that we're dealing with and we're facing. I'm sure is very current to all of you practitioners that are there and dealing with it. What does that look like? And I suppose the stability and stagnation needs to be mitigated by other mechanisms. I know some schools are talking about PE being the opportunity to get out and go for a walk around the site rather than the traditional sort of athletics and team games. I mean, that alone is quite a challenge over this next period. If you might be moving into the rugby or football or hockey or netball or whatever season that we go into, it could be that it's important not to have that huge range of activity. And some schools are talking about it's an exercise period. I know some are getting trained in yoga activities to be done in the classroom, as well as bring your umbrella, because if it's raining, you're still going to go for a walk. So the range of activities are various. So just to conclude the input section, the kind of the things that we are seeing I've articulated already. The most popular process is to keep the cycle as normal as possible. My advice would be don't change it unless you really have to. Watch the catch-up periods, this idea of having intervention classes, because we are still into that methodology and ideal of adding intervention classes. That causes issues in itself, because you are going to create multiple groups. But the underlying expression that I would use is change creates noise, noise creates disruption. And we've all experienced a huge amount of disruption over this period, and it would be best to try and keep that as stable as possible. So timetabling solutions to this methodology need to be carefully thought through and delivered in a method. I got stuck on a word there. That's unusual for me. We need to deliver it in such a way that the methodology is right for the school and that there is little disruption as we go through it. There is the input. Thank you. Unless you have questions, I see one or two. Yeah, some people catch up with the recording. It has been recorded, so if you do want to just see it through, Are there any questions on specifically in terms of where we're going? Okay, so in terms of Smart Curriculum Academy, over the next period, certainly while the change in methodology is with us in terms of moving forward, we are going to continue with the Smart Curriculum Academy webinars. For those people that are engaged with this, we are running a course on curriculum leadership and planning in September. And if you've been involved in this session, there are discounted places for the webinar in September. Our Eventbrite page has got a list of those activities, and we have the leadership webinar series coming up. Those that are planned, you can see on the screen there. The first two, keeping children safe, we've got a practitioner who's coming to talk around that whole area of innovative practice within a school north of London, and she'll talk through the processes that she's used to innovate. What you see, I'll introduce that a little later. The planned sessions the ideas that we've got for the next year, you can see on the screen in front of you, and we continue with the Smart Curriculum application introduction webinars, which will go out every month over the next term. So if you've been involved in this session, we will send you a code which will give you access to the planning, structure and planning webinar in September. We'll send it out before September, but you're welcome to join us at a discounted rate. Those would be costed sessions, training sessions, rather than these free webinar series. So thank you for being with us. It's a pleasure to share with you. I hope over this period you get some break, a chance to rest over the summer. And if you need anything, please do contact us at info@cj-learning.com, and we'll be glad to help you resolving any of the issues that you would have moving forward. Thank you.